building projects, secret deals, weddings, and more Carthage. What more could you ask for? Join me as I discuss the many headaches of Dionysius I in the Ancient Sicily mini-series on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome, my name's Neil, and in this episode I'll be continuing my mini-series on Ancient Sicily by picking up with the famous tyrant Dionysius I of Syracuse and the various issues and dramas he had early on in his reign. This episode covers roughly the period from 406 BC and lasts a decade till 396 BC, but what a decade it was. If you want to find me in the stormy waters of social media, you can do so on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and now Blue Sky as @AncientBlogger. Just remember, it's all ancient history. If you want more content, including episode notes for my podcasts and this one, why not try ancientblogger.com? You can also message me there or go old school and send an email to ancientblogger@hotmail.com. Reviews and ratings. Please keep it up, and thanks again for all those nice comments coming through on Spotify where you can do these for individual episodes. These are crucial in giving this podcast more visibility. New listeners are, of course, great, but I also want to give a shout out to all those who keep coming back. There are so many podcasts out there, and the fact that you make time for me is wonderful. Before I begin, I need to provide 2 corrections and an update. In the previous episode, I ended it by stating that by 404 BC, Syracuse had its first tyrant in place since the 460s. I actually meant 406 BC. That's where the episode ended, namely with Dionysius managing to secure supreme power. The second correction here is where I mispronounced his name. You may have heard me call him Dionysius, an easy mistake, but of course it is Dionysius. And on that, in this episode, I realise he is Dionysius I, but I'll just be calling him Dionysius. As for the update, the chances are this will be the last episode for 2024, but I'll be back in 2025. Podcasting is a hobby I really enjoy. After all, I've been doing it for several years now. But it's also very demanding. I spend most weekends and at least 2 or 3 evenings a week either researching, scripting, re-scripting and then scripting again, recording and editing an episode. I don't have any reserves, so the minute one ends, the next one begins. I also, believe it or not, have a real life to contend with, and the demands that it can make, any dramas, sickness, or nice things can affect the progress of an episode. Believe it or not, solo podcasters commonly suffer burnout, particularly those new to it, who are terrified that if they don't keep up with their schedule, they'll lose listeners and their stats will suffer. I got close to this situation actually a few years ago, but I made peace with the fact that I'll record and release without sacrificing the quality of my work-life podcasting balance. Anyway, I've been meaning to say this for a while. If you're a podcaster feeling the pressure of it all, drop me a line if you want to chat. I've actually spoken with several podcasters about this, so trust me, you won't be the first. Okay then, let's get on with the episode. The previous episode in the mini-series, Revenge and Ruin, ended with the Carthaginians heading towards Syracuse in a seemingly unstoppable fashion, having taken cities such as Himera, Selinus, and Acragas by storm. At Syracuse, an ambitious clerk had risen to the position of tyrant through political cunning, which included accusing his rivals of secretly aiding the Carthaginians. This individual, Dionysius, was now tyrant of the city, however, one with a big problem. Ironically, Carthage and its successes against the Greeks had been used by Dionysius in his rise to power, but now he faced that threat directly. Now, much of our information about this part of history comes from Diodorus Siculus, a historian born on Sicily and writing later in the 1st century BC. I've mentioned him in previous episodes, as he was a really important source. Book 14 of his work supplies us with much of the story here, and it's argued that he himself relied on contemporary sources to form his narrative. These were Timaeus of Athens, Ephorus, and Philistus. We cannot equate contemporary with accurate, though, as you might remember from my mini rant about Thucydides from the Sicilian expedition episode. Indeed, you'll hear about how Ephorus and Timaeus differ in this episode. In 405 BC, Carthage made its move against Gela, and Diodorus wrote how the citizens there led a fierce resistance to the initial Carthaginian onslaught. Each day the Carthaginians attacked the walls, and each night the Gelans repaired them. Soon help came in the form of Dionysius, who had assembled a force which numbered 30,000 according to Timaeus. This force, commanded by Dionysius, included navy, infantry, and cavalry, and each would have an important, if not complex, role to play. Dionysius' initial tactic was eminently sensible: hit the supply lines with navy and cavalry and wear down the Carthaginians. But that was only the first part. After 20 days of inactivity, a plan came together which was as bold as it was complex. Rather than a single mass engagement, the Syracusan attack would involve smaller units, each attacking at different points across the enemy front line. The idea was to sow confusion. The moment a breakthrough was made, the Greek force there would hit another spot. It would be a rolling attack made at different points. It was a risky strategy because if the Syracusan units didn't attack in unison, they would be easily isolated and overpowered, and that's actually what happened. Had it worked, we might be talking of Dionysius as a masterful general, but it didn't, and so we're not. Unable to bring their plan to bear, Dionysius was defeated and only managed to retreat through a ruse involving lighting many, many fires at night to make the Carthaginians think they were still encamped back in Gela, when in fact they'd marched back at night. The following day, the Carthaginians entered an empty city. Gela, along with Selinus, Acragas, and Himera, was now in broken pieces. As he travelled back to Syracuse, Dionysius and his army stopped at Camarina, where he evacuated the people there as well. This had been a location which had traditionally not always seen eye to eye with its parent city of Syracuse, but here the people gathered what they could and moved out. Diodorus painted a pitiful scene in which soldiers looked on aghast as maidens of marriageable age rushed along the road in a manner described as improper for their age, before commenting that the stress of the moment had done away with the dignity and respect which are shown before strangers. Dionysius now faced mumblings amongst his men, and this led to a group of cavalry riding off to Syracuse. When they arrived, they made for the house of Dionysius, pillaging it and assaulting his wife. The tyrant hadn't been ignorant of this rogue section of cavalry riding off, and had also raced back to Syracuse. The force with him were able to eventually catch them in the marketplace, killing some, with the others fleeing to nearby Etna. With one internal revolt crushed, the larger external one still loomed large. Carthage hadn't been stopped, and now Syracuse faced an army which had made short work of Greek walls in the other cities it had taken. Perhaps the only source of hope was that some years earlier, Syracuse had faced the might of Athens and had been in a similarly desperate position before things got better. Back then, the saviour had been overseas support, and perhaps a few mistakes by Nicias, the Athenian general. However, this time, no such dynamics were in play. And yet, somehow, despite all this, Syracuse escaped the experience of Carthaginians sacking the city. I say somehow, because the section covering this in Diodorus' account didn't survive. When it does pick up, it tells us how Hamilcar, the Carthaginian general, sent a herald to conclude terms of peace with Dionysius, which were agreed. The terms stripped Syracuse of much of its power base. The cities of Leontini and Messene were now independent, but most importantly, Syracuse had survived, as had Dionysius. The big question then is why? What had happened which had saved Syracuse? There are some ideas. A strong contender is that Hamilcar's army was sufficiently weakened through plague to force him to step back and force severe terms on Syracuse. This wouldn't be the first instance of a Carthaginian army suffering from disease whilst campaigning on Sicily. It wouldn't even be the first instance of an opposing army suffering from this whilst near to Syracuse. When Athens had laid siege to it, it had been forced to camp on the marshy area to the west. Plague or disease then was a plausible reason. Another argument suggested that Carthage was facing threats elsewhere, and so could redeploy these forces elsewhere, Perhaps it was a mixture of both. Dionysius might have breathed a sigh of relief, but this peace had come at a cost, though it wasn't one which Dionysius had any intention of keeping. As the Carthaginian forces headed back across the horizon, Dionysius was planning war. Perhaps the only silver lining in the Carthaginian successes on Sicily had been that they had left blueprints of their strategy amongst the broken ruins of the Greek cities they had conquered. The concept of a siege for Greeks in antiquity was largely formed of two tactics. The first was good old-fashioned patience. Cities were easily encumbered with those from the nearby towns and villages escaping into them. And though they might bring in a bit of extra food, the situation in a city could deteriorate very, very quickly. As such, simply encircling it and cutting off routes in and out of the city was often enough. This had been the primary tactic of the Athenians when they had laid siege to Syracuse, and I covered this in the Sicilian expedition episode, in case you want to listen. The second tactic was a variation of the first. This involved appealing to disaffected groups within the city who might want to ally with those laying siege to it. Perhaps a group of nobles who weren't happy with the lack of power or being cut out of some, or a political party, that sort of thing. Ultimately, the payoff would be that, under new ownership, this group would assume a loftier position than before. Once this group had agreed, they might leave a gate or two open, or swing favour to accept the demands of the besiegers. But Carthage hadn't done anything like this. They'd been masters of their smash and grab, acting in horrifying expedients. They got over the walls quickly, and the Greeks had little to counter this. Knowing full well that he'd be going to war, Dionysius embarked on a series of actions to ensure that he, and therefore Syracuse, would be far better prepared, and in the years following 404 BC, these actions fell into three main categories: improving the city's defence, upgrading its offence, and shoring up his position politically. In terms of improving the city's defence, well, eyes turned towards two locations. The plateau known as Epipolae to the north and the west of the city, and to Ortygia, the island upon which Syracuse was founded. For those who listened to the Sicilian expedition, you may remember Epipolae. This, as mentioned, was a plateau, which essentially controlled the northern and western routes out of the city and into the city. Given where Syracuse was located, these were the two main land routes into it. When the Athenians had laid siege to Syracuse, Epipolae had been the initial battleground, with both forces looking to gain control of it. When Syracuse and Athens had contested the plateau, much of the action occurred on the eastern end, the part which overlooks Syracuse. However, the main way to access it was from the western end, which boasted a gradual incline rather than narrow, steep tracks. It was here that Dionysius built a fort known as Euryalus. This, along with walls, prevented access to Epipolae from the west, exactly where a Carthaginian force might be coming from, or at least where Dionysius hoped they'd be coming from. All of this building took several years, beginning in 405 BC and nearing completion in 396 BC. According to Diodorus, 60,000 workers were hired and 6,000 oxen moved the stone to where it needed to be. Tyrants had traditionally been associated with big civic projects, and for good reason. Firstly, these fostered a sense of pride in your city. The Greek city-states were in fierce competition with each other, so we can assume that this helped boost morale, something which was much needed. Syracusans might now boast how good and expensive and modern their fortifications were. There was also an economic benefit. This activity provided work for people across all levels of society in Syracuse. The poor as labourers, the merchants who brought in the needed resources, and all of those involved in what we'd now call the supply chain. Dionysius made sure he made good political capital out of all of this. He attended the construction personally, holding competitions to see who could build their sections first and dishing out prizes. It would be easy to dismiss this, however, it's thought that Philistus, a minister of his, was the source for this in Diodorus, and it does fit in with Dionysius' approach to politics. I would also add that perhaps he used these visits to gauge his popularity and keep his political compass well orientated. The other main improvements to defence were a bit more, let's say, personal. The island of Ortygia was now fortified and homes allotted there reserved purely for Dionysius's most loyal followers and some of his mercenaries. In addition, a harbour was built there. It was what any tyrant wanted, a refuge, and a grand one at that. Just as Dionysius realigned his defences to the new type of threat he faced or would face, he realised his army and navy would also need to do things differently. Around the beginning of the 4th century BC, he brought in experts from afar to not only build weapons but design new ones. Diodorus wrote that it was here that the Greeks first developed their catapult. I say there because it doesn't seem that this was new elsewhere, and exactly what the catapult was is debated. From Diodorus's description, it was a mechanical device which shot arrows, not then the type which might loose balls of stone. It wasn't just on land. For his navy, there was the newly designed quinqueremes, a type of heavy warship which could carry a large complement of marines. I now come to the third category, improving his position politically. Dionysius looked to improve his standing both at Syracuse and outside it through marriage, but not a single marriage. Dionysius married 2 different women. If you're thinking, well, wasn't he already married? Well, the sad truth of it is that his previous wife seems to have died as a result of the assault I mentioned earlier. The move to polygamy wasn't seen by the sources as particularly good, especially since it was something which the Persian kings did. This was used to build the picture of Dionysius more comfortable with the Eastern trappings than the traditional Greek ones. However, both marriages were politically a good idea. One wife, Aristomache, was from Syracuse and from a sound family. This most likely secured the loyalty of an important faction there. The second wife, and the way he went about it, reveals how much politics was involved. Dionysius turned his eyes to the northeast of the island and across the Straits of Messina for a political alliance which would secure the northeastern part of the island. The city of Messini, modern-day Messina, was allotted land which brought Dionysius political goodwill. But across the straits was Rhegium, modern-day Reggio Calabria, and relations with it were not very good. In the 420s, when Athens had sent its first small expedition to Sicily, Rhegium had been the base of its operations. Syracuse had clashed with it as a result. Though it hadn't fully supported Athens in the second Sicilian expedition, the more famous or infamous one, there it had offered the Athenians just harbour. In short, it was no fan of Syracuse, and that wasn't necessarily a problem, except for the fact that it was just over those narrow straits, meaning that Rhegium could prove dangerous if Dionysius was campaigning out of the city, say for example, leading a lot of troops across to the western part of Sicily. As such, an offer of marriage was sent there, and the response wasn't just no, it was an insult. Rhegium did offer a bride, but not one from a noble family, and instead the daughter of the public executioner. This, then, was what Rhegium thought of Dionysius, and it was an insult which he wasn't to forget. Perhaps it directly influenced Dionysius' next move, because he made the same offer to Locri, a town to the southeast of Rhegium and a strong rival of it. The outcome here was positive, and now he had the hand of Doris, a daughter of a leading noble there. This interest in southern Italy might seem an overstretch. Why bother? Well, southern Italy was important to Syracuse. Take the mercenaries which were sourced there in large amounts according to Diodorus. If you consider the geographical context, the southern tip or toe of Italy offered an easy path to Syracuse, hence the importance of getting on the right side of Messini because of those straits between it and southern Italy. As such, it needed to be secured. And if you couldn't secure it through an alliance with Rhegium, which, as I mentioned, sat on the Italian side of those straits, then keep Rhegium on notice by allying with its rival. These 2 marriages also brought 2 characters into play, who I'll be picking up in future episodes. Dion, the brother of Aristomache, who became a trusted advisor of Dionysius, and with Doris, he had a son born around 397 BC named Dionysius. With much of this in place, Dionysius could now settle some scores. Although the defences weren't quite finished, he gambled on them not being entirely needed, at least not initially. Dionysius, after all, hadn't built them for them not to be tested, but any counter from Carthage would take time. He hoped that they would be finished by the time that they were needed. In 398 BC, he launched his attack and did so against the Carthaginian city of Motia. For those who've listened to earlier episodes, you might recall this being the first colony on Sicily, and a Phoenician one at that. It was located on the far western tip of the island itself, on a small island in a lagoon. In the mid-6th century BC, Carthage, itself another Phoenician colony, had attacked and taken it as their own. It was a vital location, both strategically and commercially. Perhaps more important to Dionysius was its importance symbolically. To make a real stand against Carthage was to make war on its main centre on Sicily. Dionysius advocated for war in the Syracusan assembly, possibly to ensure he had the backing to do so, and he made his appeal on 3 broad points. The first was that Carthage hated the Greeks, the second that Carthage lacked manpower and resources due to a plague back home, and thirdly, that those Greek cities were existing under the Carthaginian yoke, and they needed to be liberated. Each of these points are worth assessing. Did Carthage really hate the Greeks? In one sense, the damage they had wrought on the Greek cities they had effectively razed in recent years would have supported this, or at least courted an emotional response from those in the assembly who'd probably witnessed it. However, you could also counter that Carthage hadn't been the aggressor when it had gotten involved with the Greeks on Sicily. I covered this in the previous episode in case you want more details on how and why war with Carthage had ensued in the years previous. There was also a long history, don't forget, of Carthage and the Greek cities being largely content with each other. As for opportunism, well, it may have been that Carthage was still having issues with the plague back home, but as you'll hear, they weren't exactly impotent. As for the final point, this was an appeal to Syracusan pride. Let's free the Greeks, whether they want to be freed or are even in a position to be freed. A more cynical read would be, let's get our dominance on the island back and get those Greek cities back in their place, that is to say, under our influence. So it went that in 398 BC, Dionysius took his men westwards. Diodorus wrote that his force consisted of 80,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, with 200 warships sailing along the coast. But that's a very large force, and we might consider a smaller number to be more realistic. This force, or at least the infantry and cavalry, headed to Eryx, modern-day Erice. Eryx was a native settlement and seems to have incorporated Phoenician culture as well as Greek, though naturally, when Dionysius arrived with a massive land force, they were keen to point out that they were no friends to the Carthaginians. Dionysius split his forces, and whilst one campaigned in the area against the few settlements allied with Carthage, the others were set to work building moles, that is to say, earthworks across that lagoon. Whilst Carthage had no substantial force in the island, it did retaliate with a fleet which attempted to trap the Syracusan navy, which was largely stationed now in the lagoon in which Motia sat. This was unsuccessful, and eventually the infantry was able to build an earthwork across the water, and at this point it was largely a matter of time. The new artillery pieces kept defenders off the walls, with towers and rams working to secure a section of them. Eventually, a breach was made, and Syracuse moved in to take the city. Often the most dangerous part of any siege for the attacker in antiquity was if they managed to actually get in. In a weird reversal, they would now be under siege. Well, sort of. Unfamiliar streets with barricades, and all the while being hit with hit-and-run attacks from those who knew the layout of the city perfectly well. From above, defenders, which may well include women and children, would be throwing objects from rooftops and causing all sorts of casualties. However, at best this delayed the inevitable. Diodorus described a savage sacking of Mocha by the Greeks, albeit one which was more civilized than when Carthage had sacked Greek cities. In those instances, temples were not respected, and those seeking sanctuary within them were dragged out or butchered where they stood. Dionysius, being a civilized Greek, appealed to Mottians to head for the temples where their safety would be guaranteed. Just in case for a moment you thought this was a humane side of Dionysius, well, it wasn't. It was because he needed to ensure the bills could be paid. The dead don't sell well, whereas all those who survived could be sold as slaves to refill his treasury. Following the sack, Dionysius rested his men and continued to campaign in the west of Sicily. Across the sea, Carthage assembled a military response, and Diodorus cited the numbers which Ephorus and Timaeus, those more contemporary sources, had recorded. Ephorus had 300,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 400 warships. Timaeus gave a much smaller size, just, and I do the air quotes thing here, just 100,000 in total, with 30,000 of these raised in Sicily. I'll leave you to ponder on the plausibility of those numbers. This force under Himilcon retook Motia and headed to a place you may not have immediately thought of, Mycenae. You might remember this from my mentioning of it earlier. It was on the northeastern tip of Sicily and on the Sicilian side of the Strait of Messina. So why here? Well, it firstly provided a great harbour with good facilities, and it was also close to Syracuse. Its location on those straits ensured that no reinforcements could come across from southern Italy that easily. Though Messina tried to put up a defence, it was to no avail, not helped by crumbling walls and, in fact, large gaps in their walls. It must have been a nice day off, though, for those Carthaginian siege engineers. The issue facing Dionysius as he headed back to Syracuse was what to do. The local tribes near Syracuse had actually rebelled, which wasn't surprising. Dionysius had attacked these people after the first truce made with the Carthaginians. The reason back then had been their alliance with Carthage. Why had they allied with Carthage, you might ask? Well, because how they had been treated. You may well detect a pattern there. It turns out that treating locals really badly doesn't really get you anywhere, particularly when they rebel, which you resolve by treating them badly. The initial clash between Syracuse and Carthage wasn't a land one. Though Himilcon had moved south along the coast, his route was blocked by an erupting Mount Etna. This meant he had to take a longer route through the island's interior. Dionysius took the initiative and sent his navy against the Carthaginian navy, with his forces watching from the shores of nearby Catana, which would improve their morale. As good an idea as this was, the cheering Syracusan crowds soon fell silent, as their navy was beaten. Dionysius was now in a quandary. If he took his army north, he'd leave Syracuse open to a navy which could simply sail into the great harbour unchecked. It seemed as if the recent besiegers would themselves become the besieged. Worse still for Dionysius was internal dissent. At an assembly meeting, a man stepped forward called Theodorus, and he delivered a withering critique of Dionysius. Perhaps the most personal attacks came in the form of comparisons with Gelon, an earlier tyrant of the city who was seen as a beneficial ruler. According to Theodorus, it had been under Gelon where Syracuse had united the Greek cities on Sicily and given them freedom, with the reverse now happening under Dionysius. The speech finished with an ultimatum. Dionysius could be allowed to leave with his possessions or stay and face those who wanted their freedom. Theodorus is a curious figure. Did he exist, or was he an invention? A narrative device to facilitate later criticisms of Dionysius, or even the contemporary ones? We know that Timaeus, a contemporary source I've mentioned, was no fan of Dionysius. Yet it's argued that, were he an invention of Timaeus, the criticism that Theodorus provides might have been a bit more accurate. And that's because, alongside the valid criticisms he does supply, there are some criticisms which just aren't very good. For example, Theodorus noted how Dionysius had enslaved Syracuse. Well, the assembly still seemed to have a function, and there was Theodorus able to speak out against him, not exactly enslavement. there was also an argument how Carthage ruling Syracuse wouldn't be that much different to Dionysius ruling it. Given how Carthage had treated Greek cities previously, and given what Syracuse had just done to Motia, I think we can agree that was highly unlikely. If Carthage were to take Syracuse, it wouldn't be very nice for anyone. The next speaker in the assembly was Pherecydas, a Spartan who'd served as admiral for Syracuse. He was a friend of Dionysius and stated that he, and by default Sparta, wouldn't support a regime change. And with that, the threat was over, though apparently a segment of the assembly went away cursing the Spartans. What then of Theodorus's implied threat, namely that if Dionysius didn't leave voluntarily, then there would be consequences? Perhaps Theodorus was just bluffing. Though the internal situation had been quietened, there was still the problem of the Carthaginian force once more bearing down on the city. As a display of might, the Carthaginian navy had earlier sailed into the great harbour of Syracuse to intimidate those watching on. There were also raids made on the outskirts of the city by the Carthaginians. One such raid was on a temple to Demeter and Persephone. Impiety and the disrespect of sacred spaces was a common motif Theodorus used to underline the barbarous nature of the Carthaginians for a later Roman audience. You might remember in an earlier episode what happened when Carthage ignored its own soothsayers and destroyed a tomb outside Acragas. Even if you can't, you might guess. And though Diodorus doesn't explicitly link the raid on the temple with what happened next, you get the feeling he's leaving a hint. As you might have guessed, what happened next was plague. Perhaps the reason for not directly linking the plague to the temple raid was because Diodorus offered some rationale for its outbreak. A large body of men mixing together and a camp being located on swampy land provided very good conditions for an outbreak of sickness and plague. In particular, the location as that where the Athenian force had suffered widespread sickness from when they had attempted to besiege Syracuse several years earlier. The description provided by Diodorus in many ways echoed the description Thucydides gave of the plague which hit Athens. Social disorder and breakdown where the dead went unburied. And as for symptoms, well, these have been scrutinised to understand what the disease might have been. The most likely candidate is thought to be smallpox, with typhus also possibly present. Smallpox is highly contagious, and the most common form has a mortality rate of around 30%. Seizing the initiative, Dionysius launched a series of attacks on the severely weakened Carthaginians. In one instance, placing a number of mercenaries who he thought were likely to revolt in the front lines and then having the cavalry abandon them to be slaughtered. Syracuse had its foot firmly on the neck of the Carthaginian army. A few more battles against sick and panicked men and the entire army might be gone. And yet, this, according to Diodorus, presented a problem for Dionysius. The threat of Carthage was useful to him, an enemy he could unite Syracuse against when eyes were turning towards him. When Carthage contacted him about a peace treaty, he reasoned that the people would never agree to it, and so made his own private deal. For the sum of 300 talents, a core group of the army, including the leading officers, were allowed to escape on ships by night, leaving much of the army behind. The remaining forces, whittled down significantly by the plague and disease, were made captives. Some escaped, with others, such as Iberian mercenaries, recruited into the army. The baggage was left for the army to fight over. In 396 BC, a sort of peace had broken out, but not one formally recognised. If we take Diodorus's account of the private deal Dionysius had made, then presumably the average Syracusan thought this was just a failed assault by Carthage, a break in play of sorts, with the war still on, just Carthage gone. Indeed, it's worth considering that whole account of the private deal. Did it really happen? Or was it Diodorus attempting to repaint a scenario to place Dionysius in a bad light? After all, it's not as if any of those elements of the event couldn't be explained without Dionysius's treachery. Imagine that Carthage had once more been planning to assault Syracuse or put pressure on it through a show of force outside its walls. But once more disease and sickness severely affected those plans, and following some successful counterattacks, Himilcon reasoned that his army faced a greater risk by staying there. They had, after all, achieved some objectives. They'd been able to take Motia with little fuss, and had demonstrated their abilities through taking Messini. With all this in mind, the sensible decision would be to return to Carthage. None of this required a secret deal. It's also notable that the secret deal allowed Diodorus to depict the Carthaginians also in a bad light, and not for the first time. Their commanders were happy to betray their army, and Diodorus reported how this betrayal caused rebellion in Libya, which Carthage held sway over. Perhaps, just perhaps, the rebellions had begun earlier and had actually been a contributing factor in Himilcon returning home. The rebellions in Libya were not therefore as a result of Carthaginian cowardice. They were instead another reason, why they might need to return home. Now, of course, all of this is speculation, but it's a good way of considering how events might be manipulated and reported in a slightly different way to set a very different narrative. Perhaps, after all, there was a secret deal, but perhaps not. With the Carthaginians gone, a sort of stability returned to Sicily. Messini returned once more to the Greeks, and Diodorus tells us, without giving too much information, that the Greek cities previously enslaved by Carthage were now free. But as I said, he doesn't say much more else. In the next episode, I'll pick up with what happened next, and unsurprisingly, it does involve Carthage, but there are new developments too. We hear of the literary side of Dionysius, and for any of you Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans, think Volgons. And there's also the chance to avenge a very personal snub which I mentioned in this episode. If you're still with me now, thanks again for listening, and until next episode, keep safe and stay well.